Some of the best advice I ever got was actually in a birthing class. That's one of those classes that you take when you're an expecting parent, and you're in a room with a bunch of other expecting parents, and the experts standing in front and telling you how to change a diaper and how to swaddle a baby, and how to feed them and put them to sleep and baby-proof your house and all that. Important stuff. But everybody's taking notes. Everybody wants to do the right thing. But one day, they said something. They told a little story that I thought was so profound, like has such wisdom. Like I never forgot it, and I thought like I can apply that to so many things in my life. They were trying to prepare everybody for the possibility that you could end up having a kid with a birth defect or some disability, a mental or physical disability. And they said, just a certain percentage of kids have disabilities. They're just born with disabilities. But you don't always know if that's going to be your kid. So you kind of got to be prepared for that. And they said, don't think of it like, if that happens to you, don't think of it like, you're just dealt a bad hand of cards. It's not what you plan. It's different. And they said, think about it like, you're going on vacation and you've always wanted to go to Italy. You always wanted to see the Leaning Tower of Pisa and, the Vatican, go to Rome and the Amalfi Coast, whatever. And, you bought your plane tickets and you have all your hotel reservations and you got everything planned and you're all excited. And then you find out for some reason, there's a natural disaster in Italy or something, or the flights just aren't going to Italy. So you can't go to Italy. So you had to change your plans. So instead, you go to Austria. And you never thought of Austria as the top of your list for travel destinations, but you thought it'd be great. And you go to Austria and you find it's not Italy, but it's great for other reasons. You didn't expect it to be. It's basically it's not Plan A. You had to go with Plan B, but as it turned out, there were so many things that you weren't expecting, wonderful things that happened there that you weren't expecting. And what they said was, think about it like that. If you have a kid that has some kind of mental or physical disability, and it was so heartfelt, the way they told it and sort of the purpose for telling it. It was just, I was very touched by it. And it's consistent, that story, that theme is consistent with some of what's in the Bible, God's word. In Proverbs chapter 3, verses 5 to 6, it says, don't rely on your own understanding, but trust in God to direct your path. In other words, when you see the paths laid out for you and the circumstances of your life, don't think that you're always going to know the right path, that whatever you expect it to happen is going to be the right way to go. You got to trust God that He's going to actually, pick the right path. And it might not be the one that you thought it was going to be. Isaiah chapter 55, verses 8 and 9 says, God's thoughts and ways are much higher and wiser than human thoughts and ways. And what that means is, God sees the whole picture, everything that's going on, and He sees the long term. So again, you kind of got to trust God that if, you're thinking you're heading in one direction and that's where you want to go, sometimes your life is going to take some twists and turns. And, your plan A might not be God's. Your plan B might be exactly what God had planned for you. So, an example in my own life, from the time I was a kid and certainly into adulthood, I always pictured myself getting married and having kids. I thought, for me, that would be the only way to, experience true joy and fulfillment in my life. That's just the way it was supposed to go. And, after I graduated from college and then law school, time goes by pretty quickly. And, my 20s went by and I was, well into my 30s. I dated a lot of women. I had girlfriends. I just didn't find the right person that I could spend the rest of my life with. And a lot of these women were great women, but, for whatever reason, just didn't work out. And I think, sort of the dividing line, the moment where I felt like things had kind of changed from being a young adult to, entering middle age was, it was kind of my late 30s. I got in a really bad accident. I was hit by a motorcycle and I broke like practically every bone in my body. And it was like weeks and months of recovery. And when I started coming out of that, I realized like I'm no longer young, a young guy. I'm push. I'm going to be hitting 40 not before too long, and I really got the feeling like it just wasn't in the cards for me to settle down with one person, get married, and have kids. And I kind of had to just accept that, and I did. I was just like, okay, Lord, this is it. This is my plan B, but okay. And so I started to say, like, well, how am I going to live my life as a perpetual single person where I could still be fulfilled and happy and do a lot of the things I wanted to do? So first thing I did was I bought a house. And I bought this great little house in Arlington, Massachusetts. It had a nice pool, built-in in-ground pool in the backyard. But it was kind of in a family neighborhood, but I didn't care. I wanted a house. I wanted to have a garden. I wanted to have a backyard that I could hang out in and have my friends over. So I moved in. I remember my neighbor, I met her for the first time, Gail. She came over and she's like, oh, I'm so happy to meet you. Welcome to the neighborhood. And she said, but it's, we thought it was kind of odd, a single guy buying a house, in a kind of a family neighborhood. And I was like, yeah, no, I know, but I wanted a house and I wasn't going to wait to get married. It's like, this is what I want. And she's like, oh, okay, whatever. And the next thing I did was I started to travel a little bit. Like I'd never really understood what the big thing about travel was. It just didn't appeal to me. I never really thought I'd like it that much, So I took a trip. My first trip to Europe was right then. It was like 38 or 39. I went on one of those tours, those like guided bus tours of Spain, with all the old people and everybody. And I loved it. I just loved being in a foreign country. I loved just seeing all the culture and the food, and I was like, oh, okay. It was like I caught the travel bug. And then 6 months later, I went to France, and then after that, I went to England, and I was just like, awesome. Like I wouldn't be able to do this if I had kids. I'm just going to travel. And the other thing was, I started to really appreciate more my brother and sister's kids, my nieces and nephews, and think like, you know what? I'm the cool uncle. I love that role. I'd get them so riled up. They'd be like, I'd be throwing them all over the beds, and they'd be laughing, they'd be bouncing off the walls and everything else. I remember one time when they got a little older, they kind of staged a rebellion against me, and my brother, he was a very strict dad, and I think he never said anything to me when I would like get the kids all riled up and just totally let them get out of control. But one time I said to him, the kids got older. They, like I said, they staged a rebellion. They came after me, and I said to my brothers, like, you got to control your kids a little better, which is a little ironic. And he said to me, Spencer, you reap what you sow. So he had no sympathy for me. But I just had so much fun with those kids. I used to play these little games. There was my niece, and she was my godchild, Stephanie. I had this one game I played with her. It was called Lots of Fat, Little Fat, or No Fat. And she was probably around 8 or 9. And, we were teaching the kids about nutrition, my sister and brother-in-law and me. And so we played this game. It was just Steph and me. And I said, and I would say a food, and she had to tell me whether she thought it had a lot of fat, a little fat, or no fat. And it was actually really fun. Like I would say, like, okay, celery. And she'd go, no fat. I'm like, yeah, very good. Butter, and she'd say, lots of fat. So I gave her a couple easy ones, but then I'd give her, I'd throw her for a loop. I'd go through like, well, what about apples? No fat. Yep, very good. How about broccoli? No fat. Very good. How about avocados? And she'd say, no fat. I'm like, lots of fat. It's just the good kind of fat. And then I'd kind of go in the other direction. I would be like, pepperoni pizza. And she's like, lots of fat. I'm like, yep. Cheeseburgers. She'd say, lots of fat. And I'm like, yep. And then I'd say, Hershey syrup. And she'd say, lots of fat. And then I'd be like, loaded with sugar. They've got emulsifiers, but there's no fat in it. So anyway, I used to play these games. And I remember at Christmas time, I would go to Toys R Us and so my brother had 7 kids, and my sister had 4. So there were 11 nieces and nephews, and I'd buy them all presents. And again, it was like, I just loved my role as the cool uncle, the fun uncle. And I thought, you know what? That's for me. That's better. I don't have to deal with like kids, day in, day out. I get all the upsides and none of the downsides. And I remember at one point, I was, I guess I was just about turning 40, sort of laying in my pool. I had this floating device. I would lay in my pool. I think I had a beer. It was like a beautiful sunny Saturday afternoon. I had my boombox on, listening to music, and I just felt like, yeah, this is good. Okay, God, I get it now. I get what you had in store for me. But then, of course, you know how things go. It was like right when I accepted my singleness, and I was like, stop trying so hard on dates and trying to find the right person. It was like a few months later, I met the woman of my dreams. Within, I think it was like 6 months, we got engaged, I got married, had kids, and everything else. It was like, okay, I guess the single life wasn't my plan A, God's plan A for me forever, and it moved. And sort of the moral of the story is we don't know God's plan for us, and we have our expectations for the way our life is supposed to turn out and what's good for us. But sort of God sees the big picture. He really does. So you got to just kind of accept what comes along, make the best of it, and know that it really is for the best for you. So it's just about accepting the circumstances and knowing that in the end, again, God sees everything. He sees us today. He sees us in the future. He sees us for eternity. So we just got to trust in God and know that whatever happens, that that's according to His will, and it's for our best interest because He loves us. So anyway, that's it for today. Hopefully we'll see you next time.